Welcome back to the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. Throughout my journey of learning about justice, I've had different existential questions at the back of my mind as I've encountered new information. But one I keep coming back to is, why are Christians still behaving this way? Why are Christians seeking to conserve and preserve power? Why aren't we caring for the groups Jesus defined as our neighbors? Why are we only turning to Scripture when it suits us? And on the questions go. I've certainly found many ways to answer these questions over the years, but today's guest provides a new insight about the way white American Christians practice their faith. That guest is Dr. Michael O. Emerson. Dr. Emerson is the director of the Religion and Public Policy program and the Harry and Hazel Chavon Fellow in Religion and Public Policy at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, the nation's top-rated academic think tank. Dr. Emerson's work focuses primarily on the intersection of religion, race, and politics. Increasingly, his work focuses on religion and its public policy implications. He has co-authored 16 books, most recently The Religion of Whiteness, How Racism Distorts Christianity, Kingdom Racial Change, Moving from Inequality, Injustice, and Indifference, and the 25th anniversary edition of Divided by Faith. Our conversation today dives into the religion of whiteness. In doing research for this book, Dr. Emerson and co-author Glenn Bracey found that the majority of white American Christians center their understanding of whiteness rather than the teachings of Christianity in such a way that their faith practice can be sociologically defined as a religion separate from Christianity. Put more simply and starkly, many white Christians do not in practice believe that ultimate power comes from God, but rather from the way whiteness functions in our society. If you're still with me after that description, there's a lot more to learn from this conversation, including a discussion about how religion is defined sociologically, identifying markers of the religion of whiteness, and profiles of different types of people inside the religion of whiteness. Now, if you will, join me for this conversation with Dr. Michael O. Emerson. My name's Eric, and this is the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. Our conversation will begin right after this. The Biblical Justice Resources Podcast is supported by listeners like you at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and helping to resource individuals and the church for the pursuit of biblical justice, please consider giving today at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. Again, visit patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources to help support the podcast. Now on with the show. Dr. Emerson, thank you for joining me here today.
Well, I'm really delighted to be here, Eric. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, so like I just said to you, you're the first person who I've totally talked to via Instagram, so it's good to make your acquaintance at least virtually here, if not in person yet. Want to just get started right off the bat talking about this book that you co-authored, The Religion of Whiteness, because as I just said to you, I saw you in person giving a presentation about it earlier this year, and then two different podcast guests told me that I needed to read this book. And then I did, and I was like, this explains so much of what I've seen, especially in the last year or so, just of personal experience kind of being in this space. So I'm curious, you say in the book that a lot of the research for this started before what you call, I think, the upheavals in 2020, what some people have thought of as sort of this racial reckoning. Whether that did end up happening or not, a lot of things happened in 2020. What led to the research of this starting before 2020? What led you and your co-author into thinking about this?
Yeah, so I had published a book with another author back in 2000, kind of looking at evangelical faith and race in the U.S. And so it had been, more than 15 years, and we wondered, has anything changed? So we applied for a grant, got the grant, and then started the research. And really the question was just, what is the state of the church and race in the U.S.? So that's how it started. And that, started about 2018 is when we finally got into the field and started talking and interviewing people. And then, of course, as you mentioned, a lot happened in 2020. So we just continued the research. And as we get into, I'm sure, in this talking about this book, what we ended up finding and writing about was quite a bit different than I think we thought when we started the project.
Yeah. And even so, the book in 2000, Divided by Faith.
Yes.
Yes.
Mhm.
So that was a book that was early in my journey of learning about race and justice and reconciliation. So
Oh, great.
that set up a bunch of things for me as well. 2000 seems like it would be, and probably I guess the late 90s as you're doing the research for that seems different from 20 years later. What are some of the differences you found in how race was being discussed or approached?
Yeah. And I'll just make a shameless little plug here that Divided by Faith has the second edition coming out in November of 2025. So we try to update that as well. But when you're talking like the late 90s, mostly people are talking about race really doesn't exist anymore, or racial issues aren't around. We had the civil rights movement in the 60s, and we're just so advanced now. So this was, of course, according to white folks, especially white Christians, that was the narrative. So we were looking at, well, as evangelicals back then were trying to, uh, there was this realization I should mention that, hey, we're pretty separate from each other. We should try to find a way to come together. So there's a movement called racial reconciliation. And yeah, there was a lot of talk about and a lot of action among evangelicals. So what we were actually saying and arguing in the book based on our research was, because of what we call these cultural tools that are given to us in evangelicalism, individualism, that we make change one heart at a time, one relationship at a time, and that big things like public discourse, public policy, we kind of avoid those because that's not the heart issues. That those things actually were deepening racial division and were very, very different than the way Black Christians were talking and thinking and acting on race. Okay, so that's 2020. I mean, 2000. So you're asking, what had changed? What had changed is that race had become much more evident, racial division, much more, uh, we become much more divided, actually, and more strife. So we were seeing white Christians basically, uh, well, I don't know if we should get right into the argument or you want to keep talking. Let me ask you, where would you like to go?
Yeah, I think we'll get into that here in a moment. I do have a
Yeah.
question about sort of the foundations of the research itself and that process, but it is as you're talking about it, it's like, yeah, that seems like the stuff that that you presented in the book. But what I'm always curious about, since I like just sort of touched on sociology in my academic studies, is how we know, or how you as a researcher know that the research you do is representative of the broader public in general. I mean, with 350 million Americans, and you're talking to a much smaller group than that. And there's also, I know, a difference here between quantitative research and qualitative research, which I feel like qualitative just takes more time. You're talking to fewer people. How do you know, as you're doing this research, that what you're finding is representative of the broader religious sphere, American sphere, all of those things?
Such a great question. This is something like if you went to graduate school in a social science or any kind of science, you spend so much time learning how to do what we call probability sampling. So that when you only talk to a couple thousand people, but as you noted, you want to be able to say something about all 300 plus million Americans. How do you know you've done that? And that the way you've done that is indeed that every single person has an equal chance to be selected. So if you only select 1,000 of them, but they all had an equal chance, the way probability theory works is you have the what we call representative sample. Those folks will represent all 300 million. You'll get the whole variety and the whole spread of different views. There's some debate, how many people do you need to talk to? Uh, but we've gotten better and better at that. And in this project, we talked to several thousand, so we went way beyond what would be the minimum needed to do that. So that's how we know.
Interesting. So how then do you select the people who are chosen? What does that process look like?
Yeah, these days you do well, usually there are online surveys now, and people are randomly selected. Used to be by phone numbers. We don't do that anymore. Now you have companies that generate these random samples. They might have 100,000 people, and then they'll randomly sample from that 100,000 whatever you're willing to pay for and can afford. I think we did 3,000 people. So they are then invited to respond to the surveys. They go through them, they do their answers, and then we have that representative sample. And one of the things we do, of course, is we'll say, we only want to talk to people who are 18 and over. And in our case, we wanted to talk to half the people who are Christian and half who are not, so that we could do some real comparisons.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting. I've got some questions about that as well, the differences you saw between those two things. But what also strikes me about the book is it seems like it's from I guess in my mind it's from a particular perspective. Like there's this focus on white evangelicalism, I think in both Divided by Faith and in this book. How what does it look like then to talk both to white evangelicals and then to white non-evangelicals and non-white evangelicals? What was the difference in the process of kind of parsing out responses from each of those groups?
Yeah, you do find differences. So I mean, we could go on to, there's all kinds of different ways we could talk about this. If we boil it down, white evangelicalism is very much a moral project about changing the heart of an individual, what we might call the life world, and the family unit. And so much is focused on that. And surprisingly, when you talk to like mainline or more liberal Christian churches, that's a different project. The project is about maximizing good in the world. So it's a much less focus on the individual and much more on uh, policies or doing ministry throughout the globe. So I'll give you an example. A different colleague, George Yancey, and I had written a paper looking at that religious folks, especially conservative religious folks, have more children than everybody else. So we wanted to look at why. And we also wanted to look at why more liberal Christians had very few children. And it came down to what I just described. So for folks that were conservative Christians, they were saying, children are a blessing from God because there's so much focus on the centrality of the family. It is kind of just on their mind all the time. This is part of what it means to be a Christian. When we talked, oh, and the more you can have, the bigger the blessing. Every child a blessing. When we talked to liberal Christians who would maybe have one child, they would say that the world is overpopulated. And so it is their duty as a Christian to limit that overpopulation by having as few children as possible. So if there's two people coming together, they have one child, in the next generation, they'll have cut the population in half. It's kind of the simplistic way of thinking. But notice the difference there. They're not really focused on themselves or on the intimate micro world. They're focused on some kind of big abstract issue, population. They just talk so differently about issues. And that's just one example.
That is, yeah, that's really interesting. And even as you're saying that, I'm like, maybe I'm not as many diverse spaces in that way as I think I am, because that one example is a new perspective for me. But I also wonder if it kind of feeds into uh, the research, sort of another foundational question I had, which is that you pretty explicitly state in the book that this is a sociological perspective, kind of defining religion, defining what this group thinks of as religion, and maybe not so much we are looking at this from a religious, theological, like we have this theological view, thinking about other people's theological views. Uh, how does that work? I think is the simplest way to ask the question. But like in terms of being a person of faith, uh, entering in as a sociologist rather than a theologian, how does that form or shape the way that you're interpreting the research? How does that shape then the argument that you build in the book?
Yeah, so just for listeners who don't know what sociology is, it's the study of groups and people in the groups, the relationships between groups. Whereas theology, right, is the study of God, of what's right, what's wrong. It's a cosmology, it's a theocracy. So we're supposed to, as sociologists, social scientists, in a sense, be nonpartisan, just supposed to study what's actually happening, describe what's actually happening, not take a moral stance or a normative stance on this is right, this is wrong. Now, that's very hard, easy to say, hard to do, of course. And certainly we cross the line sometimes. And as a Christian writing, I will usually at the end of a study say this doesn't seem to align with the Christian teachings and so on, or it does, one way or the other. So that's the sociological method, and it is based on empirical data. It means we don't. Sometimes I'll call it armchair philosophy. So theology and philosophy are about thinking about systems and how things fit and what should be. Something like sociology is asking a question, going out and collecting data, whether that's surveys, whether it's focus groups, interviewing people, whether that's studying what's on the internet, different methods, but collecting the data and then describing what is.
Yeah. And I do think at the end of the book, you kind of provide some of that, what you think of where things are. And I'm curious as you're saying it just to myself of like, I had a certain perspective reading through this of like whether I think this is right or wrong, whereas someone sort of inside the group you're describing might have a different, like, just interpreting the facts could be interpreted different ways depending on where you are uh,
Hun-
in terms of this.
100%. Yeah, right. Just saying here's what is just is the beginning because then there's the debate and the discussion about, well, what does it mean?
Yeah, because spoiler alert, I have a perspective that maybe this is not the direction white evangelicals need to go, and maybe someone else feels like, yes, this is appropriately describing the way that we should be viewing the world.
Mhm.
So let's maybe jump into the book itself. I wrote down here the first sentence. Maybe I should just open the book. It might be faster. But the first sentence of the book, I was like, you really like right off the bat, letting people know where this is at. Race has always been central to the American story. Like
Yes.
that, uh, to some folks, I think would be just seen as a factual statement, and to some folks would be seen as, why are we starting here?
Yeah.
Why are we starting here? Why does the book start right at that spot?
Yeah, because it is a study about the impact and centrality of race among a whole cross section of Americans today. So we need to set up right away why we are going to be focusing on race. Because the US really, unlike any other country, the closest one in the world would be South Africa. Because of when we were founded at a time that this idea of racial groups and that you could rank these groups was really coming into fruition across the globe, especially in Western parts of the world. So what happens then is because that's the kind of the new way of thinking about people groups, that there's this thing called race. It used to be, ethnicity, culture, but now it was something deeper. And that got woven into the very foundations of this nation, into the Constitution, into the understanding, even into the forefathers' definition of who is an American and who is not, how to be a good American and who is not a good American. That's why it's just always been here. So whether it's below the surface, above the surface, it just seems to always be there.
And then also importantly for this book and for Divided by Faith, it gets woven into the church in the United States as well.
And that's the most important thing. Exactly.
Yes.
Yes.
So, uh, Based on the title, people maybe do or don't have sort of a understanding of what the religion of whiteness could potentially be. You go through the process in here of defining what religion is and how you come to say this is what the religion of whiteness is.
Yeah.
What is this sort of starting point for defining what religion is?
Yeah, and we come from it. There was a one of the founding sociologists, maybe the greatest sociologist of all time, spent infinite amounts of time thinking about what is religion. So not what is true or not true theologically, but what does it that religion does? Why are people all over the world religious? And why is there variety, right? There's Christians, there's Muslims, there's Buddhists, and so on. So he wanted to understand what is the essence, the function sociologically of religion, and what he had arrived at after. If you ever read the book, you would realize how painstaking it is, just hundreds of pages of analyzing it. And one of the things he finds is it's not, say, the worship of God, because there are religions, such as Buddhism, that don't clearly have a God. So what he found is in common across all religions is that you have a system of beliefs and practices, things you believe, things you do, that are oriented towards the sacred. And the sacred could be defined as God, the sacred could be defined as Buddha, the sacred could be defined as your own group. So it orients you to that, and then it tells you what is profane, everything else that shouldn't be part of the faith. So what is sacred and what is not, and then how to orient yourself to the sacred.
Which, as you're saying it, I'm like, this sounds like it could also be describing like football fandom. Like this,
Yeah.
this is, it is sacred to cheer for this team. It is profane to have anyone from opposing teams in your area. That's, I think, a much more trivial example of that. This defining that in terms of religion of whiteness, I think gets to something much more uh, front and center where we are in the United States. So maybe now that we've gone through this whole like foundational, how we get to understanding even the grounds for this argument, how then do you come to say this is a religion of whiteness? This is what we're seeing in the research that says whiteness now is becoming a thing that religion is being formed around.
Yeah. So when you hear people talk about it, and we designed some experiments, we can talk about those a little bit later to try to test this actually. If, for example, people have to choose between kind of biblical Christianity and the importance of a white worldview, we found that about two-thirds of all practicing Christians, those mean practicing meaning they go to church, um, will favor whiteness, being white over the interpretation of the Bible that is more consistent with historical understandings. So here, let me just say what we say the religion of whiteness is, and we can talk about it a little bit more. So think back to how it defined what religion is. So for the religion of whiteness, it's a systems of beliefs and practices that sacralizes or worships whiteness. So I'll define whiteness in a moment. And declaring profane anything else that isn't white, that is not associated with whiteness. So it's really it's a disfiguring of historical Christianity, so much so that we say it's a competing religion, and you have a mix in different churches. Some people favoring one, some favoring the other, some trying to straddle and do both. So what do we mean by whiteness? Well, it's a funny word because it seems a little bit obtuse. So we'll just give a simple definition. It's just white people, and it can be others as well, worshiping the dominance of white society. So let me say it the different way. It's a distorted view that projects an assumed power onto whiteness, okay, in which white people become co-creators with God. Ooh, I'm making some people mad, but this is the case of what we mean by whiteness, where white people become co-creators with God, deciding themselves the terms by which humanity can and cannot relate to itself. So whiteness ultimately says, hey, you can join me, you can join us on our terms because our terms are correct and your terms are not. That is whiteness. It's a power. And part of what we say is why this becomes worshiped is people can get drunk with power. The Bible is full of saying, beware of these kind of false powers. When people get together, and you mentioned a football game or at a big rock concert, you feel something you cannot feel sitting alone. And it is that power of the group all focused on something. So you can feel this in church too, as the music's playing and there's people everywhere and the excitement rises. And we are saying this is part of what we call this this worship of the group almost. It's you can't feel that apart from the group. That's ultimately what we mean by the religion of whiteness.
Yeah, I think there are two things with that caught my attention immediately. The first is two-thirds of uh, presumably white Christians are in this religion of whiteness sort of definition sphere. The other, the way you defined it, is the basically where is the power centered? Like we are the ones who are in power and in charge of deciding who is in and who is not. Which, to me, hearing that says that is outside of an orthodox religious or Orthodox Christian understanding. But I wonder for people inside of that, if you experience them feeling like, no, that is Orthodox Christianity. That's, I think, we're wondering on a theological side. Like, do people inside of what you would define as religion of whiteness feel that they are just Christian and that is the appropriate way to understand Christianity?
Yes. I don't think I've ever met somebody who said, hey, I'm a member of the religion of whiteness. No. But the folks that are in this do exactly what you say, that there literally is a right way to do things, a right way to relate to God. And it is the way that I and my people do it. So if Latinos don't do it our way, they're doing it wrong. If African Americans don't do it our way, they're doing it wrong because not seeing it, but my white Western practice is the one and only correct way. And I have the power to enforce that upon you. Either you will change or you don't get to be part of me.
Yeah. I mean, we could talk for hours about this, but we don't have that much time today. So I'll probably end up coming back to some of that a little bit, but I want to talk now about you define different markers of religion, or like there are markers of religion, and then define what the markers of the religion of whiteness are. I wonder if you could go through at least a couple of those to kind of talk about how do we identify what an understanding of the religion of whiteness is based off of how people are practicing it.
Yeah, so we say that basically there's three ways to look at it. Every religion has sacred symbols, and then as we mentioned, every religion has a set of beliefs and a set of practices. So we can quickly go through those. So the sacred symbols, which are very important in the religion of whiteness, are a white Jesus. And you can see that in representations all around the world. We don't exactly know what Jesus looked like. I guess we could try to estimate based on what part of the world he's in, but he certainly wasn't a European person. We can be quite sure of that. But in this religion of whiteness, Jesus must be white. Second of all, is that there's a merging of the cross and the flag. The flag could be the US flag, the flag could be the Confederate flag, but they merge so closely that they really are one and the same. And then third, and this is a one that's been emerging ever more, is uh, what we'd say is a sacred symbol of firearms representing power, like that the power to enforce these beliefs. Now, we say that there are six beliefs, and I'll just mention these. So, of course, you wouldn't be surprised to know the first one is a commitment to whiteness, that it's right, that it's superior. But also, and this is a really flipping, I think, the understanding of historical Christianity, that God is on the side of the dominant group, the world's winners. And the world's winners are white people. So how do we know that the way white folks do things is right? Because they are the blessed. They have the best houses and the best neighborhoods and the most money and they own the most businesses. That's how we know, because God will always be on the side of the dominant. Now, of course, if we just take a sidestep, there's nothing in Christianity that would say that is the central theme of God's message, that he's with the dominant groups. In fact, there's a whole lot more about he's with the marginalized, but not in this religion. Third, and this one's really important, so I just want to take a moment on it. Whiteness is universal. It's normative. It's unseen. Now, here's how it becomes unseen and why people don't say I'm a member of the religion of whiteness. Jesus is universal. All Christians agree that Jesus is for everybody. Nobody would argue, no, he's not for Native Americans. Yeah, we know he is. So Jesus is universal, but we already know in the religion of whiteness, the sacred symbol, that Jesus is white. So think of what happens when you put those together. The universal then is white. Jesus is universal, Jesus is white. The universal is white, and white is universal. Once you do that, then you don't have to see white anymore. White is just what is and what is right. So you get a fourth belief that you center understandings and theology and values that are white, but you would never say they're white. You would just say they're right. And then you can sidestep or put to the side everything else. So you could have black theology. You don't have white theology. You just have theology. You don't have, uh, yeah, we get the point. One people probably hear a little bit about. This is actually the political arm of religion of whiteness, is white Christian nationalism, where you have this fusion of Christian symbols with American civic life. And we see that in the sacred symbol, right? The fusion of Christianity, the cross, with the nation itself. So that's how you get to nationalism, Christian nationalism. And then when it's white centered, white Christian nationalism. And then finally that all other understandings and groups are inferior and they have to try to live up to the white standard. Now there's 5 practices too. And maybe we can talk a little. I'll let you tell me, but one is highly selective use of Christian biblical scriptures. I wonder if we should
Yeah.
talk about the example of that, where we tried to test that.
I think that would be interesting to do. And this is one of the markers where I said earlier in the conversation, I've been seeing, like, it has explained what I've seen in my experiences in the last year. This, I think, is one of those things where we say we trust what the Bible says or that we want to have that be the foundation of what we do, but then only really when it helps us is sort of
Yeah,
the like thing. And then if it doesn't, well, maybe this is out of context. Maybe we don't understand it the way we should, but we're not too interested in actually figuring that out. So whatever example you want to go through here, let's go ahead and do that.
sure. Yeah. So, we did this experiment that was embedded in the survey. So nobody really knows it's an experiment. But what we did is that we had 4 Bible verses come up, and they were what we call hyperlinks, right? You could click on it and see the actual Bible verse if you wanted to. Um, so I'll just give one example. So the first ethnic conflict you find in the Christian church is in Acts, and the way that the disciples, the apostles, solved that issue of the ethnic conflict between Greeks and the non-Greeks was they empowered the Greeks, the ones that felt like they were being marginalized, to make the decisions they needed. So, for example, then in the survey, we give that verse of that, and then we say, therefore, it is good to empower the marginalized group, something like that. And then people can strongly agree, all the way to strongly disagree. We did this with 4 different things, and what we're basically doing is just saying, here's a verse, and then we say, therefore, it's good to do what the verse says. Now, in each case, it was something about another group, or if it had to do with your own group, it was about confessing sin of your own group. Okay, and then we had what we call control test, where it just says, Paul says we shouldn't use unwholesome words, therefore we shouldn't use unwholesome words. Agree, strongly agree, disagree. All right. So when we compared these across, we're just looking at practicing Christians now. Again, what's a practicing Christian? They go to church at least once a month. They say that I am a Christian and they say my faith is very important to me. When we looked at that across the different racial groups, what we found was that of all racial groups, the majority strongly agree we shouldn't use unwholesome words. All racial groups, the majority agree that we should empower racial minorities, that we should confess our group's sin, that we should welcome the stranger, that we should welcome the immigrant, except one. One group does not, and that is white practicing Christians. Two-thirds consistently disagree that that's what the Bible says when it's about another group. They don't consistently disagree when it's about individual piety, as we mentioned. They believe you shouldn't use unwholesome words. So something's going on. So we did what we call then focus groups, where we went to churches and we had groups of, say, 5 to 10 people, always of the same race. So we could talk to them about this and we would ask them the same questions. And when they disagreed that that's what the Bible said, we'd have a discussion. Why does the Bible not say that? Okay, so we filmed these, and this is important because when we were doing them, we didn't notice this. When groups disagreed or people in the group disagreed, they would say, well, you got to know what comes before and what comes after those verses. Hey, that's pretty good contextual analysis. That's true. It's what you're supposed to do. So typically the groups would pull out their Bibles or their Bible apps and start looking at what came before and what comes after the verse and then discuss it. Again, except one group. White Christian groups, when we had that, would say, well, you'd have to know what comes before and what comes after. But they would not pull out their Bibles and actually look. They simply were using it as a defense for why they didn't have to agree with what the Bible said in that case. When we, in the survey, if they disagreed, we said they could write down why they disagreed. And it was very common to say something like we had a question on um, the Bible saying to welcome the stranger and the foreigner. It doesn't even say anything directly about immigration, but those who disagreed went right to, you don't have to accept legal aliens, legal immigrants. Again, it doesn't say anything about legal or illegal, but they went right to that kind of a politicizing the verse. So when we say highly selective use of Christian biblical scriptures, all conservative Christians will say they're Bible centered. You take the Bible literally. But what we found is if they subscribe to the religion of whiteness, they do not.
which is disappointing from my perspective.
Hmm.
And this is where there's so many different tendrils that we could explore. I'm curious, it feels like from my perspective that a lot of what we're seeing today is a race to define oneself as being marginalized in order to maintain power. Is that something that you saw along these lines as well?
Yeah, in fact, in an earlier book just on American evangelicals in particular, we say in the DNA to always feel like you are the marginalized, you are under attack. So yes, it does seem like every group, but especially the group in power currently feels like they are the group disempowered. Therefore, they must organize and fight back.
Which then I also wonder, it feels like along with that sort of a definition of, or trying to embody that definition is also this like we are the ones in power, we are the ones making the decisions. And along those lines, it feels like then there is a so you need to be like us in order to be in the right, but then also like a trying to keep at arm's length other people. So it's like we are in the best neighborhoods. You should want to aspire to be in our neighborhood, but we don't actually want you here. And you can think of that neighborhood wise, you can think of that United States nationally wise. You could probably find a whole bunch of other ways to define that.
Yeah.
And my struggle in forming a question is like, how do people think that's right which is maybe unanswerable at this moment. But how does that fit into a person inside of the religion of whiteness feeling like that is appropriate practice of Christianity, sort of from what you have seen and analyzed?
Yeah, I think you're really hitting it on the head because we could go forever on that. And it really is. Uh, we have the best neighborhoods. We like our neighborhoods. You should aspire to be in our neighborhoods, but we don't actually want you in our neighborhoods. Or if you come in too many numbers, we're going to go and find a different neighborhood. We've seen that pattern in the US over and over. How? This is why we ultimately arrived at, we're not looking at like some kind of misunderstanding of Christianity. We're looking at a solid, fundamental, different religion. And that's how it's so easy to continually practice and believe things that are not biblical. I know for lots of folks who look at Christianity, especially if there are people of color looking at it like, how can a Christian do that? Then my guess our response would be a Christian doesn't do that. A practicer and a follower of the religion of whiteness does that. The religion is built giving you credence and acceptance to be able to do the very things you were describing, Eric. That it is okay. In fact, it's preferable that you have the best neighborhoods and you defend those neighborhoods. And again, it could be, as we're seeing now, that you create the country you want with the people you want in it, and you can dispel the people you don't want.
And it is right because we are the ones in power. But then at
Yes.
the same time, if someone else were to take power who was outside of that group, people inside the group would not be then be like, oh, they are the ones in power now, so they get to decide what is right. They still would feel that theirs is the normative view,
Yeah.
which I suppose leads to the the marginalizing, the attempted marginalizing behavior and discussion,
Hmm.
which is not a direction that we need to go right now. But one of the things I'm curious about with inside of this group, in the book, I don't remember specifically how you define the two groups inside of the religion of whiteness, but in my memory, it is like a passive follower and an active follower. Whereas like the passive group is maybe, I think, if memory serves, is a larger group inside of that, and they're just kind of going along with this as the way it is. Whereas the active group is like actively defining, actively saying, yes, whiteness is right, and other realities are not. Uh, is that an accurate
Yeah.
memory on my part? And what is that sort of? If you could delve further into what that looks like, that'd be great.
Yeah, you're really pretty close there. So and I think this distinction is important, and it's not something that we discovered until we started analyzing the data, and it became so crystal clear that within the religion of whiteness, there are two groups of followers. So one that you mentioned, we'll call the white veil. And what they do, and they're about 75% of the religion of whiteness followers. The white veil folks, they say they have kind of a mantra. If we were to summarize, it'd be something like this: there is no race, there is no racial inequality, there are just people. There is no race, there's no racial inequality, they're just people. So that's where the veil comes from. Anytime there's a push for people to say there's inequality or we've got problems, then the mantra will come out. And for the most part, that works quite well. But when it doesn't work, such as in 2020, then you see the other 25%, what we call the white might group. And the white might group, by the way, is about 10 years younger on average than the white veil group. And they see race and racial inequality everywhere. But what they see is it is white folks under attack, white folks who are discriminated against. And it is their Christian duty to fight back. These are folks who are so much more likely than other white people to say that race is important to them, that being white is important to them, that they feel the need to defend their race, and that they will defend their race, even if it means they have to take up arms. Again, that's about 25%. It's a younger group, and you'll see them when we're in our most intense moments of racial division in our country. Otherwise, because it's a smoother way to operate, that 75% will do the work by just simply saying it's not there. I think there's cancer in our country. No, we do not have cancer. And that's kind of their answer.
And just sort of our norm is the norm, and so we're just going to assume that that is the way things are. Is that sort of the understanding then?
Absolutely. And we have the power to tell you that you're wrong and we are correct.
It's very frustrating for me to hear and to like not in this moment be able to do something about that. But
Yeah.
we can explore more as we go on here. But one of the things as I was going back through the book, preparing for this, that caught me by surprise again was thinking not now just religiously, but based on religion, but also politically, is that it's you defined that the white veil group, I think, would be overwhelmingly majority identify as Republican, but that the white might group was actually less likely to define themselves as Republican. And I was curious if that mean I can't, based off of my understandings of our political parties here, it doesn't seem like there would be a lot of white might Democrats. I could be wrong, but does that mean then that the white might group is further to the right and wouldn't define themselves as Republican because of that? Or are they totally outside of the political system? What does that look like?
Yeah, they tend to be outside the political system or be more likely to say that they're independents. Uh, they are much more likely to be MAGA supporters in the current times. So in this particular case of Donald Trump, they are very strong supporters thereof. But, when you didn't have a Donald Trump type way of speaking, they didn't find the Republicans before him satisfying. They weren't directly enough talking about defending the white folks.
Which then I think begs the question, since you said the white might group is younger than the white veil group, did Donald Trump, MAGA, everything that came along with that help give voice to this group then to say this is what this looks like?
100%. Absolutely. Really gave credence to this group what they were feeling and gave them a boldness to be able to come out of the woodwork when needed. And so that's why we do see them every once in a while.
I Again, it's indicators of things I have seen, but it is things that I wish were not the case. I'm not, for the listener, I'm not an objective observer in this right now. I'm, I'm feeling things in some sort of a emotional way right now. Uh, some of the other things that we talked about or that you mentioned as sort of the markers and the practices that I've seen in particular are this uh, I forget how you phrased it, but like this desire to not actively like research or actively like all of these groups are saying, let's actually open the Bible and see. But for people inside of the religion of whiteness, it is actually like a positive or an active marker to say, no, I'm not going to do that, which then I think opens up the frustration I've had inside of people who define themselves as Christian is the like an active ignorance, like an active
Yes.
like I don't need to know what else is happening, and not and then anyone or anything trying to sort of get into my knowledge base is a threat to my existence as a they would say Christian.
Yep.
Uh,
Well, let
what?
me just jump into this because I know
Go
you're going
ahead.
to ask,
Yeah.
but we had talked about what are the practices, and we really only talked about one, and that was the highly selective use of Christian scriptures. But you are describing the second important practice, which we call the epistemology of ignorance.
Yeah.
Epistemology meaning how you come to know. So when we say epistemology of ignorance, how you come to not know, this is an actual valuable practice among the religion of whiteness folks, and you just described it. It is that we will actively not know the truth, not know or not debate it. We did well, we had a natural, we call a natural experiment. So we had done our first survey in 2019, summer of 2019, and one of the questions was, does the US have a race problem? And, we weren't surprised to find massive gaps. The group that was the most likely to say we don't have a race problem, or the least likely to say we do, are white Christians. More than other whites, far more likely to say we don't have a race problem than Christian African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, Native Americans, so on. But we know what happened in 2020, the summer of 2020, and all the upheaval. And we thought, what if we could go back and do the survey again? What would happen? And because of this epistemology of ignorance, we actually predicted that white Christians, after all of the stuff they're seeing on the television and in their social media feeds, are going to be less likely to say we have a race problem. And that's exactly what we found. Whereas every other group was more likely to say we had a race problem. So in just the span of 1 year, the gap, which was huge to begin with, became even larger, substantially larger between white Christians and everybody else. That's the epistemology of ignorance.
And then I'm just looking at the clock, and we're not going to have time to get to everything I want to get to. So I'll try and rapid fire a couple things. But another thing I saw that you touched on in the book is this, like the the perspective of the religion of whiteness is that the way to solve the problem of race or the way to solve political issues or anything is evangelizing. Like
Yes.
the way to everyone else has different responses to this, but primarily people inside the religion of whiteness would say the way to make things better is to evangelize people into the Church of Jesus, which is another thing I have been seeing and I would say combating. It's hard to say that I, as an individual, can combat that view. So then the question, I guess, is: are people in that group actually evangelizing people into Christianity, or are they just trying to evangelize them into the religion of whiteness?
Yeah, the latter. And this comes, out of a set of questions, but one was, do you think that discussing racial issues in church is a good way to address racial division? All groups, Christian or not, said yes, except for white practicing Christians. They did not believe that's the answer. So when we asked, well, what is the answer? That's what you said. You need to convert people to Christianity, which in reality means convert people to my understanding of Christianity, this religion of whiteness.
Which then, quickly here, understanding then just sort of the church impact, church sphere, what we're seeing inside of churches as more as a whole than just individuals. Would you say that there are more like entire churches are practicing a religion of whiteness, or would you say like there are churches where the leader would be defined as a practicing Christian and a lot of their congregation is in the religion of whiteness, or vice versa, there are leaders of churches who are religion of whiteness practitioners, but then there are actual like practicing Christians inside of that church? What does that sort of look like?
So there's some of all of what you said. There's all these different combinations. The most common one would be actual Christian leader with a mix of people in the congregation. And so that Christian leader always knows when they step on the toes of the religion of whiteness, because they could preach directly out of the Bible, but it has something to do, say, with uh, ministering to the poor. And then they will be, or especially if it has something to do with like immigration, they will tell me over and over, they're inundated with people coming up after and saying, stay away from politics. We want the Bible, even though he was just preaching directly out of the Bible, right? That's because they're religion of whiteness followers, and that's their understanding then of what Christianity is.
And then I also have a question about whether there are non-white practitioners of the religion of whiteness, and if so, what you have seen out of that group in the research.
So I will preface it, yes, there definitely are. And there's actually a book coming out soon by my co-author, Glenn Bracey, that focuses entirely on those folks. Why would people of color, a much smaller number, but why would some adopt the religion of whiteness? I will give you just a little taste of why, but part of it is these different groups compete with each other for the favoritism of the power group. They all know which group has the power, which has the money, which has all the resources, access to everything. So If you try to adopt this, the idea is then I will be included in the group enough to receive some of those resources. This is where you get that term sellout, right? You're selling us out to try to get some of the goodies that this power group has. But that's indeed what is happening, and it's happening religiously. I'll adopt your version of Christianity because then I can be truly accepted as a fully American, as fully Christian, and start getting some of those goodies. Let me give you a quick example. I just read a book
Go
by
for
a
it. Yeah.
African American pastor in an African American church, and he was describing people that have left his church and gone to white churches, and they come back and talk to him and say finally they have true worship. Finally, they're learning about the Bible. Finally. And he says, they're saying this to me. This is my life. I am a pastor. Because what they're saying is this white understanding of Christianity, I've totally bought into it. I have adopted this religion of whiteness. And you, pastor of black church, you are not practicing the right way. That's what they're saying.
So, unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time here, and I'm feeling discouraged if folks can't tell from my uh, silence gaps. Uh, so then a question that probably deserves much more time than we're going to be able to give is sort of a what do we do? And I wonder like how that ties into why you even wrote the book. Like presumably some of the reason for writing the book is just to define and give language to what we're seeing, which I think some folks probably could just feel is obvious, and some folks maybe need more of a definition. So that I think can be part of what we talk about here. But in terms of like actively, I wonder if it's just like the evangelicalism ingrained into me that is like, no, now we need to evangelize in a different direction, which I don't actually know how helpful that is. There's also some level of like, ultimately, God needs to be the one who is actively changing hearts. There's a previous podcast guest who talked about his job is not to make the change, his job is to set the table. And so I wonder then if it's not our job to actively change people's hearts, what does it look like then to set the table for if we are a person who sees someone in the religion of whiteness and says, that is not where I want you to be. Here is a more accurate Orthodox understanding of Christianity. What does it look like to set the table for that person?
Yeah, so okay, there's two ways to come about it. So that way, what you described, which is that kind of one-to-one and relationship style, I myself have tried this, and it is stunningly difficult. The resistance is amazing. Uh,
Yeah.
and you will get accused of you kind of selling out to some kind of liberal understanding of Christianity, and so that becomes very difficult. I actually, with a couple of different co-authors, just published a book sort of in response to Religion of Whiteness, which is What Do You Do? And it is called Kingdom Racial Change. So it goes into a lot of depth. Obviously, we don't have time to talk about all of that. But within churches, one of the things we say is we need a social movement. Lots of change, real change happens not at the individual level, but social movement level. And I know when you say social movements, people think about marching in streets and stuff, but it doesn't have to mean that either. It can. We need a movement. I call it the Roe Must Go campaign. Within our churches, we need to ask people, do you want to be a Christian or do you want to be a religion of whiteness follower? You don't have to, you get to choose, but this church is only for Christians. It's those that want to actually learn the way of Jesus. If that's not your interest, you need to move on. Or if they're not going to move on, we'll move on. But we need to have a siphoning out, a separating of religion and whiteness folks from actual Christianity. You know, one of the huge consequences of having these folks mixed and these churches mixed is people that are thinking about, do I want to be a Christian, see the religion of whiteness and say, no, I do not. And it is very destructive, not only for the people practicing it, not only for the people that are next to them in the churches, but for the whole case of evangelism and discipleship. It's destructive.
Yeah. I said that would be the last question, but I can't help but add on a tag here because uh, there have been a lot of conversations and research done about this rise of the nuns, Nones, and this idea that a lot of people will not come to a church to hear about Jesus. You need to go to them, which a lot of my looking into that and understanding has been like, well, have we just been weeding out people who have been nominally Christian from churches? What I was convicted of is that non-Christians can also go to church. Like it is okay for non-Christians to be in the church and to like learn and try and figure things out alongside of practicing Christians. So I totally understand the like we need to siphon out the perspective of religion of whiteness from an understanding of Christianity and in a way then remove that from our churches. But if we want to have people continuing to be alongside us and learning alongside us, uh, and say welcome in people who are religion of whiteness practitioners into the church at the same time as Orthodox Christians. Is there a way to do that and have a leader say, we are going to, this is what's how we understand Orthodox Christianity. It's based off of the Bible and off of Christian tradition. And this is where we're going to be. You are welcome to be here if you are willing to learn from that. But if not, like there's part of me that doesn't want to kick people out of church, but
Hmm.
how does that all land for you, and what your perspective would be on that?
Yeah, I'm with you there. So when I say siphoning out, that's siphoning people that just don't want to be discipled. They're not willing. They've already made up their mind, right? But what we would hope, yes, is that a church could stand firm, the pastor, the other clergy members, the staff, and that there'd be enough parishioners that are standing firm, trying to grow in their Christianity, and then can help others, right, adopt and learn. The the challenge is to not have the religion of whiteness folks overwhelm. Like you have to have the right number, the right balance. But yes, ideally that's what would happen.
Yeah. Well, whether it's a good place to end or not, that's where we're going to be ending for today. And hopefully, if you're listening to the podcast, you're able to come back and hear more things, uh, and pick up the book because it's good to, like I said, at least define, have language for this is where we are, and it may not be as uplifting as other things you would like to have happen, but it is good, I think, to be able to place ourselves with where we are. So, Dr. Emerson, thank you for coming on and kind of talking through some of the things in the book.
Well, it's been a privilege, and no matter how it may sound in what we've talked about, we know in the end God wins, so there's hope.
Amen. Thank you for listening to the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. This podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Eric Beck. To learn more about how you can be resourced for the pursuit of biblical justice, visit our website at biblicaljusticeresources.com.